From the Missouri School of Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. From Hong Kong to Lebanon to Spain, the world has been awash in anti-government protests in recent weeks. That's been particularly true in Latin America. Now, over the past month, major protests have erupted in several countries, from Chile to Haiti. Now, while the trigger for upheaval in each country has differed, they all share at least one thing in common: the targeting of journalists and the press. Now, these have ranged from attacks on the offices of news outlets to the seizure of radio transmission equipment to forcing newspapers to fire critical journalists. So on this edition of Global Journalist, we're going to look at some recent troubles for the media in two South American countries in particular. In a few minutes, we'll discuss events in Ecuador, where reporters covering massive anti-government protests last month faced threats both from the police as well as from protesters. But to kick things off, we're going to turn to Bolivia. There, President Evo Morales' claim of victory in recent elections has triggered almost 3 weeks of mass protests. So for this, we're going to bring in two people who have been following developments there closely. Joining us from La Paz, the capital of Bolivia, is Raul Peñaranda. He's a fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy and the managing editor of the Bolivian news agency Agencia de Noticia Fides, as well as a columnist at the daily newspaper Página 7. Raul, welcome.
Yes.
And also with us from Edmonton, Alberta, is Pascal Lupien. He's a political scientist at the University of Alberta who researches political movements in South America. Pascal, welcome.
Thanks for inviting us.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. Raul Peñaranda, you're in La Paz. Let me start with you. So let's just get an update on sort of the source of the current protests in Bolivia. President Morales has been in power there since 2006. He was running for a fourth term in elections last month against several different opposition leaders. And to avoid a runoff against his top opponent, he needed to get more than 40% of the vote and beat the second place candidate by 10%. And so when the returns started coming in on October 20th, he was only leading by around 6 to 7%. So tell us sort of what's happened since then.
Exactly. That night, electoral night, when 83% of the vote was counted, he had that 7% lead. But then in the 17 remaining points after 1 day when the recount was reassumed, he had more than 10 points lead. In the 17% remaining, he had a 24% lead. So that started a wave of protests in Bolivia because the people think that electoral fraud was managed to be made by the government. So now we have protests in most of the Bolivian cities, riots, very violent situation. Yesterday in Cochabamba, which is in the middle of the city, of the country, one person died, a young man of 20 years old, and 100 people were wounded. So we have a very tense situation, violence in many cities, in the streets and roads.
And tell us what the opposition is asking for here. They're saying that this election it wasn't valid. What do the opposition leaders? What are those protesting? What do they want to happen?
They want to cancel the elections and to call a new election from the start. And but the government has not accepted that. The government wants to keep this result. But anyway, there is an American, the OAS.
The Organization of American States, this sort of multilateral body, has become involved in auditing
exactly.
the vote count.
Exactly. So we are waiting for that auditing of the election. Maybe this audit will ask to do a second round, and that maybe would be a solution for the violence now in Bolivia.
Okay, so in other words then, after the election results are audited, the OAS could say, well, actually, Morales, he won by less than 10%. This means there needs to be a runoff election between him and his top opponent, and that may lead to some sort of resolution then. But if I could turn this to you, Pascal Lupien, Evo Morales, he's unlike many of the leaders that Bolivia has had in the past. Remind us sort of what's different about his political movement from Bolivia's past leaders.
For one thing, Morales identifies as an indigenous person, which is a significant thing in a country with a very significant indigenous population. that hadn't really had an indigenous president for, well, since the country has existed as a republic. He also has put into place a number of policies that have been very popular with a large segment of the population, and these have had a pretty significant impact with respect to reducing poverty and inequality. So, and it is important to point out that there are demonstrations on both sides. I mean, I'm not in Bolivia right now. I have lived there, and I'm in daily contact with friends, some of whom are actually journalists, so that there are actually protests in favor of Morales as well, and some clashes between protesters.
And Raul Peñaranda, if you could pick up on this just for a moment, then you have worked in privately owned media for a long time. As we mentioned, Morales was running for his fourth term. There has been some significant tension between sort of the private media on the one hand, that owned by independent of the government, if you will, and Morales' government. Talk to us just a bit about that.
Yes, Morales is an authoritarian leader. So he has tried to co-opt to control the media, private media, independent media in the country for the last decade. And he has been successful doing that. I think that most of the media outlets in the country are now pro-government in a way or other. He has done that, especially using big budgets of government money to provide advertisement to the media. That was one of the things that he has done. And so now we have very few media outlets that can be called independent or critical with the government.
So in other words, when you talk about big budgets for the media, we're talking about government advertising then for TV stations or for newspapers. This is a very important source of revenue for the media.
Exactly. So the government has augmented in 10 times the budget that the government had in last years to provide this advertisement to these media outlets. So the government has millions of dollars to provide or to give to the media outlets, and this has been a way of co-opting or controlling those media outlets.
Okay, so in other words, then the government is able to push the private media outlets into being less critical through the use of this cudgel, this sort of hammer that they have in the form of advertising budgets. But Pascal Lupien, give us just your perspective on this, because obviously, like, it sounds like some of the divide within Bolivian media is just a reflection of divides within the politics of the country itself.
I think some of it is, but I think it's also important to point out, and this is what I've argued in a few of the articles that I've written, is that what we had in Bolivia prior to Morales was a private press, private media that was controlled essentially by a handful of fairly powerful families and conglomerates. And one of the things that I think is really important to understand is that freedom of information, so freedom of the public to have access to information that they need to make decisions about political decisions, is not necessarily about just, completely free private media, because that can also be very limited in terms of the perspectives that are presented if those perspectives are only reflecting the worldview of a handful of wealthy media owners. What I think this government has tried to do in various ways is to shift things, and what they've done is they've shifted things too far in the other direction. But I think that you can have...
Sorry, what do you mean they've shifted things too far in the other direction?
I think what my colleague was just talking about is that now things have been shifted so that the media now is perhaps too controlled by the government in various ways, whereas previously it was controlled also, but controlled by a different set of actors. It was controlled by some private actors with their own agenda. Now it tends to be very controlled by the government. And neither situation is really ideal for the population in terms of this idea of freedom of the public to information.
Well, Raul Peñaranda, if you could pick up on this point, I mean, you have worked in privately owned media for a long time. You're the editor of Brújula Digital. I mean, I understand that you yourself have faced some particular difficulties with Morales' government. Talk to us about those.
Okay, yes, of course. Because I'm a critical journalist. I have been attacked by the government, verbally attacked. Even President Morales mentioned me a couple of times, saying that I'm a traitor, trying to destabilize the country, the government. Not only me, several of my colleagues have been going through this kind of smear campaigns. So this is a very difficult situation for journalists working in independent media outlets. The government is very, very tough against those kind of media outlets.
I understand the state telecom company launched criminal proceedings against you last year. Talk to us about that.
Yes, that was in January, and I ran a story in Brújula Digital, and they started this trial, the criminal accusation against me, but I received the solidarity of my colleagues, and also this was a kind of an international thing, and at the end they didn't proceed with the suing the trial, but they intended to do that. This is to really to make journalists to have fear. They don't go so far, but they send these kind of messages so we could really stop working as journalists.
Well, Pascal Lupien, how do you see overall trust in the media changing in a place like Bolivia? I mean, you point out that previously Bolivian media, it was sort of dominated by a handful of wealthy oligarchs, if you will, from the capital city, didn't reflect the interests of the poor. It is a poor country, didn't reflect the interests of indigenous people. Now it's led by this sort of authoritarian leftist leader. But I mean, how does that affect sort of the overall public trust in the news that they're getting?
So, I mean, and this is some of the research that myself and some local research associates are doing now, and the trust is very low. But this is actually reflects sort of a wider phenomenon that we see, not just in Bolivia, but everywhere, including in your country. And I think the country is so polarized that we have, people simply don't trust what they're getting. I can say, for example, that in the past, Reporters Without Borders, which usually is not generally an organization that attacks private media, it actually did so in Bolivia back in 2009, where it actually felt compelled to criticize what it called Bolivia's growing hate media. So they talked about how radio and television shows were routinely broadcasting programs that promoted hatred against the indigenous majority, well, whether it's a majority or the indigenous population. And so that broke trust, I think, a long time ago, long before Morales was in power. I think a large segment of the population, particularly the poor and indigenous Bolivians, already had some problems with the media for those reasons. And now I think it's perhaps being reinforced on the other side, where people who don't support the government are suspicious of the media.
Well, Raul Peñaranda, our time does grow short. As we mentioned, there has been a lot of violence. Tensions are quite high right now in Bolivia. Give us just a sense as to what you think is going to happen next on the political front. Is there some reason for optimism that this can be resolved peacefully?
Well, we hope so, but we have to wait for this audit, this international audit. Maybe if there is a second round, that would be a possibility of having a peaceful solution for this. We don't know if the government is going to accept that. Even the opposition has said that is opposed to this auditing of the elections. But maybe that's one thing that could be a peaceful solution, a second round. Let's see if the political actors, government and opposition, accept that. But I don't see much more possibilities of that.
Well, Pascal Lupien, Raul Peñaranda, thanks so much to both of you for taking the time to join us.
Thank you.
Jason.
A reminder that you're tuned into Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. On today's program, we're talking about threats to the media amid political upheaval in Bolivia and Ecuador. So next we're going to turn to Ecuador, where protests sparked by an end to government fuel subsidies turned violent last month. The situation was so volatile that President Lenin Moreno briefly had to move the seat of government out of the capital, Quito. The situation also proved a dangerous one for journalists in the country. And so for more on this, we're joined by two other guests. With us from Mexico City is Dagmar Thiel. She's a former Ecuadorian journalist and the director of Fundamedios USA, a group that monitors press freedom in Latin America. Dagmar, welcome back.
Hello, Jason. Thank you for having me.
And with us from New York is Natalie Southwick. She's the Central and South American Program Coordinator at the Committee to Protect Journalists. Natalie, welcome.
Hi, Jason. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, Natalie, give us just a little bit of context here. Ecuador was ruled by a leftist strongman, President Rafael Correa. He left in 2017. He had a very adversarial relationship with the press and introduced a lot of restrictions on journalists. Give us just a little bit of background as to how the situation was in Ecuador 3-4 years ago.
Sure. I mean, I think journalists in Ecuador are kind of coming out of this period of almost PTSD from the Correa presidency. It was an extremely difficult 10 years for the press in the country. He found a number of different ways to try to attack and undermine the media. It's interesting to contrast it to the strategies that your previous guests were talking about in Bolivia, where the attempts of the government to kind of undermine and control the media have been a little bit more subtle, whereas in Ecuador, for the most part, it was very direct. You had the president going on these sort of tirades on his weekly television shows, ripping up newspapers that he saw as critical, opening lawsuits against individual journalists or media outlets, many of which were intended essentially to bankrupt the outlets and drive them out of business. It's a similar strategy to what we've seen in some cases here in the US more recently, but just generally trying to both publicly in his rhetoric and directly through legal measures and lawsuits to undermine and kind of weaken the media.
And Natalie, he would lead, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, he would lead like Twitter attacks on individual journalists. I believe he, in one case, even went after a newspaper cartoonist and forced him to draw an apology newspaper cartoon.
There were a lot of people that were forced to apologize. Yes, the cartoonist was one of them. That was kind of the most extreme case of making a cartoonist issue a formal apology. And there was kind of this Twitter army that would descend on users that criticized Correa, or especially ones that he particularly mentioned on Twitter, that would harass them. Again, it's a strategy that we've seen replicated in a lot of countries since then, but Ecuador was kind of one of the first places where we saw this trend of
at the time it seemed quite novel, perhaps less novel in 2019. But Dagmar Thiel,
too familiar now.
Yes, if I could bring you in. So Correa, he was succeeded by his vice president, Lenin Moreno. At the time, I mean, I think there was an expectation that he would continue many of Correa's policies. Talk to us about how things have changed under him.
Well, the expectation of Rafael Correa was placing him in the presidency and having all this regimen, this authoritarian regimen from the socialismo del siglo XXI just going on. But Lenin Moreno did what probably none other leader could do, and that was returning to institutionalization of Ecuador. We changed the communication law that was so restrictive for freedom of the press, and that took almost 1 year working together with the social civil with all the society, and as well with the government that started putting everything again on place, as well as trying to get the national budget again on track after 10 years of spending a lot of money, doing a lot of work, but with many corruption cases that were being investigated. Lenin Moreno started judicial prosecution against the former president, and he has his vice president. He was on the ballot with Jorge Glass.
And we should say that Correa actually has left the country. He's living in Belgium now, I believe. Is that right?
He's living in Belgium. And Jorge Glass is in jail for almost 6 months, and there are suits against many of the authorities of the former president. So he was just trying to investigate all the corruption.
Okay, all right. Well, let me turn this back to you, Natalie Southwick, then, because Lenin Moreno, one of the things he did try to do, as Dagmar was mentioning, was he was trying to restore some fiscal stability to the country, and that led Ecuador to take a large transfer of money from the IMF. But this came with some restrictions, and one of the things that he had to do was end fuel subsidies in Ecuador. And this was extremely unpopular and triggered these huge protests earlier this month. Give us just a little bit about what happened during those protests, what happened to the media that was trying to cover them.
Sure, it was an extremely challenging couple of weeks for the media in Ecuador in a different way, I think, than what we've seen over, certainly the last decade. as I said, a lot of the prior threats were legal. They were harassment. We didn't really see as much direct physical violence against journalists, with the exception of a reporting team that was kidnapped and killed on the border with Colombia last year, but that was a bit of a different context. With the protests, we really saw, journalists out in the streets covering what was going on, getting caught in the crossfire of confrontations between police and protesters. Our colleagues at Fundamedios have the much more specific data than we do since they're on the ground there. But there were dozens of incidents of press freedom violations, journalists being blocked from entering certain spaces, journalists being attacked when people saw their cameras. There was an installation of television station Teleamazonas where some vehicles were set on fire. Journalists were prevented from leaving the buildings. There were a lot of efforts to stop people from reporting on what was going on. And, most concerning, there was a lot of repression and violence, specifically from the police targeting journalists.
Yeah, Dagmar, if you could pick up on this then. So the police, as Natalie mentioned, in several instances were targeting journalists, arresting journalists, detaining them. Another feature of this, though, was also that the journalists themselves were being targeted in some cases by the protesters. And this seems somewhat new in Ecuador.
Yes, actually, as Fundamedios, we had 138 journalists attacked. We reported about 138 journalists attacked. 30 of them were kidnapped for over 9 hours to inform about what the indigenous people were trying to say to the whole country. And 8 journalists were detained. And we had 2 very violent attacks against the same media outlet. Freddy Paredes from Teleamazonas, when he tried to escape the place where the indigenous kept also the police forces and the journalists kind of kidnapped for 9 hours. He was hit by a stone on his head and was seriously injured. And we had also one media outlet, Teleamazonas, was set on fire by protesters. And the first 4 days of the protest, the police was responsible for some of the violent attacks, but they turned to the people who were among the protesters, and a lot of undercover or infiltrated people that turned in very, very violent against media. The hate speech that was put to ground by Rafael Correa is already on the people, young people who don't believe anymore on media, who say, you are corrupt media, you are not telling the truth, you are not saying what you have to say, and they are just attacking and rejecting and intimidating journalists all around the country. So we had a lot of cases of journalists intimidated, not by the police, not by the organized crime, but just by protesters. So that's a new form of violence that we are facing there.
Well, Natalie, I think this also speaks to just how little trust ordinary people have in a number of countries now in the media. Talk to us just a little bit about that. What's driving this?
I think there are a lot of different things driving it. We're seeing it. It's really a global trend, that there are particularly authoritarian leaders around the world that are intentionally using certain types of rhetoric. Obviously, fake news is one of the most popular ones, which I always want to point out was really used first by Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. He was kind of the pioneer of the fake news discourse. But that's one way of, diminishing trust in the media. There's also, as Pascal pointed out earlier, there are many countries, especially many in Latin America, where the media has historically been, the mainstream kind of legacy media has been owned by a small number of people, and many people in those countries see those particular outlets as kind of perpetuating the interests of those owners. I think the last 10 or so years have seen an incredible proliferation of a diversity of media, which is hugely important for exactly what Pascal mentioned in terms of people having access to a broader swath of information. But I think that, that we're seeing this global trend of leaders that really want to control the narrative, that want to control information, that want to kind of have the information both within their country and that's coming out of their country on lockdown, because that allows them to kind of do what they want with less questioning. We know that a free press and a critical independent press is fundamental for a democracy and for keeping people informed. And when there are attempts to undermine that, it allows leaders to kind of consolidate their power.
Yeah, Dagmar Thiel, if you could speak to this as well. I mean, do you see the same phenomenon that appears to be occurring to some degree in Bolivia and Ecuador, also in the United States?
Yes, absolutely. And in Chile also, in the last unrest you had also, El Diario El Mercurio was also attacked and set on fire, and many journalists attacked. Also in Barcelona, in the last protests from the separatists, they were also attacking media that were just informing. So I think we have to face a new reality that people don't trust anymore media, and probably we have to start rethinking how to work in this world of social media, where everybody is just reporting, where misinformation is the standard, and where people don't understand exactly which is the role of independent media for democracy.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this discussion has been troubling in many ways. Natalie Southwick, what do you think? What do you think some possible solutions are going forward?
I think one thing is just making sure that people have access to information, that they don't feel like their access to information is limited, because that really can help build this distrust. And also it would be incredibly helpful if we had leaders that were also speaking out on the importance of a free press, that were supporting a free press instead of trying to undermine it. We've seen this repeatedly, particularly with President Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who has adopted a lot of the Trump, Duterte, Erdogan kind of strategy of attacking the press. And I think it's really important to have not only presidents, but political leaders and other leaders emphasizing how important a free press is and how important a critical media is.
But certainly some of this must fall on us too, like on the citizens, on people, to be discerning about what is fact-based news. No?
I think absolutely we need to think about media literacy and how we make sure that people are able to get the information that they need and that they are able to understand that information. And again, I think that that's where we have more tools at our disposal than ever to tell stories and to keep each other informed. And there are many examples of independent outlets across the region that are doing really incredible work and getting information to their communities in a way that's accessible for those communities. So I think looking to those examples, thinking about new models, whether it is radio in rural communities, whether it is making information available in indigenous languages in Central America, figuring out how to make sure that people have access to
Natalie, I'm sorry to cut you off here. We're just out of time here, but you're raising a number of good points. I'd like to thank Natalie Southwick and Dagmar Thiel for taking the time to join us.
Thank you.
Thank
Global
you.
Journalist is a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute at the Missouri School of Journalism and KBIA, Mid-Missouri Public Radio. Many thanks once again to Raul Peñaranda, Pascal Lupien, Dagmar Thiel, and Natalie Southwick for joining us. Our assistant producers this week are Kasey Bader, Benjamin Brink, and Grace Huguelet. Edom, Kassaye, and Trevor Hook are supervising producers. Kyle McCubbin is visual editor. Takia Thomas is audio engineer. Kathy Kiley is executive editor. Our director is Travis McMillan. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for tuning in.